Poverty causes crime. Racism causes obesity. Climate change causes mental health issues. Many of us may think that these kinds of assertions reflect recent, irrational outgrowths of liberal thought. No one would say such a thing 100 years ago, right? Well, actually, someone did. Statements such as these have their intellectual roots going back to the 18th century, when philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau put forth the idea that men are born perfect in the state of nature, and it is society that corrupts them. Today, I am pleased to welcome Spencer Klavan, author of How to Save the West, back to the show to discuss Rousseau in our continuing Thinker of the Month series. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that you're having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified every time I post a Julie Noted news video or a Timeless episode. And also be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. The time has come. It is August for the third Thinker of the Month series. Hopefully we will be in the hundreds of these episodes. I'd love to see them continue. And God knows there are a lot of thinkers that we could devote these episodes to. I'm so happy to welcome really my co-host in these episodes, Spencer Klavan, back to the show. Spencer is a features editor of The American Mind. He is also an associate editor of my favorite publication, the Claremont Review of Books. He is the host of the Young Heretics podcast, one of my favorite podcasts. And he's also the author of How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises, which you viewers know is in my top 10 all-time favorite books. So Spencer, it really is great, as always, to be with you.
It's such a pleasure and an honor. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, that's very nice of you to say. So Rousseau, we have a lot to talk about with this Genevan gent, who dates back, as I said.
Citizen of Geneva, yeah.
Yes. Dates back to the 18th century. Before we dive into his early childhood, which is, you know, and the viewers know how I like to start each of these discussions, I would like to set the scene here by reading a Rousseau quote, which I think synopsizes his entire ideology in one phrase. The idea that progress in civilization and human development has overwhelmingly benefited mankind seems like an obvious, uncontested assertion to people in 2023. But way back then, Rousseau said, and here's the quote, "Progress has been in appearance many steps towards the perfection of the individual, but in fact, it has been towards the decrepitude of the species." So this is someone who is fundamentally anti-civilizational. He thinks that civilization has been a net loss. Where does a thinker like this come from? How was he raised? What was the time that he was born into? What was the early development of a kind of thinker like this?
Okay, this is off the top of my head, so you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that quote you read is from the very first major essay that Rousseau ever published. It was for a prize competition. And you're right, this idea that civilization is a kind of artifice that cramps and distorts our natural humanity, that's central to Rousseau's entire career. And I think you really can't understand this part of him without understanding his Protestant, indeed his Calvinist background. So as we mentioned at the outset, this is a guy who grows up in Geneva, at the time part of a Swiss confederacy, and you know, would eventually, of course, become a major city in the modern nation of Switzerland. But the background that he's emerging out of is a background steeped in this Calvinist theology, and it's a middle class background. He was very proud of this, and that's why he would often sign his work, you know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Citizen of Geneva. His family were artisans, they were watchmakers, and so he's got this kind of, if you like, almost quasi-populist idea about the middle classes and the industry that it takes to make real things rather than just come up with fanciful ideas. But at the same time, he rebels very strongly against the kind of central idea of Calvinism, or one of them, which is total depravity, which is the notion of original sin more broadly, kind of regular feature of Christianity, but especially in the Calvinist Reformed tradition becomes a real object of attention, that mankind is broken in some fundamental way. There is no one righteous, no, not one. The one of the most famous lines Rousseau ever wrote, by contrast, is mankind is born free, but is everywhere in chains. And so this idea that has come to be called the noble savage, and we can get into how accurate that is as a description, but this notion of the Edenic past of mankind here on earth, before all of these social mores and rules got in the way, before all of this power relationship and all of, especially the oppression of private property. That's an important feature here too. Before all of that got in the way, mankind was and is essentially good. His nature can be molded by laws back to its original excellence. And that's the project of everything we ought to be doing. Our education, our laws, our politics, it all needs to be hearkening back to the original goodness at the core of our nature. And I think that really what this represents is a fundamental argument against that Christian idea of original sin. It's actually a very old heresy. It's called Pelagianism, after the guy who first came up with it many centuries before Rousseau, but it comes roaring back in Rousseau's thought, and as you rightly indicated, is a major feature now of almost all liberal social theory.
Absolutely. Wonderful analysis. Very important point. You're right that there's this kind of inversion of the Christian understanding of our origins. Christianity holds original sin. Rousseau holds original perfection. And as I was reading Rousseau in college, in Professor Harvey Mansfield's class, who I know, Spencer, you know, and we love Harvey, I remember saying to Professor Mansfield, how did Rousseau know? How did he know that we were born perfect, that the state of nature, you know, the most primitive societies, we were all just frolicking through the daisy fields in harmony? It appears that Rousseau makes these gratuitous assertions about an idealized, flawless past. And again, you just wonder, what is the basis?
Well, that is really an excellent point. I mean, it's said that at one point, you know, Rousseau received a visitor later on in his life, and the visitor said, "Men are wicked." And Rousseau responded, "Men are wicked, yes, but man is good." And I think that speaks to exactly this kind of disconnect that you're describing between Rousseau's imagined state of nature and the evidence that is everywhere around him and us on the ground all the time. One of the things about the Christian teaching of original sin that personally I find really compelling is it's one of the only assessments of human nature that takes the facts on the ground as they are. It's the one that conforms most directly to the actual evidence.
Yes.
We look around at people, we study history, we understand that actually there's never been a time that we know of that where this kind of supposed perfection of human nature has been embodied on earth. And even Rousseau's claim that man is born free but is everywhere in chains kind of raises this fundamental problem. Well, where is this so-called state of nature? Where is this good man? Where is this golden age? I mean, this is a long-standing debate before the 1700s. You know, Rousseau himself is kind of grappling with thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, who has kind of the inverse idea, right? That without some kind of social contract, mankind in the state of nature lives a life that is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And for my money, at least, right, this takes the facts on the ground as they are. Rousseau wants to push back against this, wants to say, no, actually, it's our failed social contract. It's our kind of illegitimate and undemocratic or anti-democratic idea of how to live together that has contorted us from our original perfection. This is a notion that is very deep in the human heart. We all have, from time immemorial, we've all yearned for some lost golden age. You get this in the, you know, the poems of Hesiod. You get it in the story of Eden in the Bible. We have a deep-seated sense that there was a time somewhere back in the mists of history when men lived together well and were happy. The fundamental difference between the Christian assessment and basically all the other options on the table is that in Christianity, we place that perfect time, and in Judaism too, we place that perfect time outside the reach of history. It never was in a time that we can access. Eden is a place that we have been sent out of because of our own wrongdoing, and the angel stands with the flaming sword to prevent our journey back. And that means that the only way forward is through. The only way to really live a righteous life is to accept the reality and to work with the imperfection of human nature. This is, of course, Edmund Burke. This is the American founding. But in the Rousseau model and the Pelagian model, because the Golden Age was in a time that actually can be accessed by us in real human history, because of that, we have to kind of strive to get back to it and to return to this perfect year zero. And you can see in this the ingredients for all of our modern utopianism, all this idea that if heaven was once here on earth, then it can be here again. And our politics is not just designed to keep us from killing one another, to keep us free, but is actually designed to reshape us into our original glory. The fundamental problem with this is that there, as you've indicated, there's no good evidence that we can ever be forced into perfection, and so attempts to do so, well-intentioned though they may be, usually end up in poverty, murder, and abuses of justice.
I'm so glad that you said this, because some viewers listening may say, well, you know, Julie, you may think it is a gratuitous assertion for Rousseau to say that we are originally perfect, but you make the gratuitous assertion that we are originally sinful. And so I just want to highlight, Spencer, your point, because it's really important. There is a hell of a lot more evidence for the fact that we are originally or inherently sinful than there is for our original and inherent perfection. Also, you know, you say that we see in Rousseau a lot of I call him the intellectual godfather of the modern liberal thought. When you hold that human beings are born perfect, that there was this golden age, then all of the problems that we see today is everyone else's thought. Fault, excuse me, not thought. Everyone else's fault, except for the human being. This is the whole, I opened the show with poverty causes crime, climate change causes these mental health issues. I mean, these lines are literally headlines of Bloomberg, New York Times articles. It is an in vogue and accepted opinion now that the human being isn't responsible for his or her own actions or outcomes in life. It is all these external forces that make it such. That comes from Rousseau.
There's something very important here about what you're saying, because if it is the case that all of our dysfunctions, all of our vice, all of our sin is a result of something external to us, then ultimately our problems and our mistakes and our sins aren't acts of moral failure, but at base they are pathologies. That is, they are diseases. There is something that has crept into us, and so we become no longer so much moral agents as patients suffering from an illness. We're not the way that we ought to be, and so those who can see better need to cure us. And I really think there's a straight line from that idea to our present idea of the kind of hyper-therapeutic model of justice. When we talk about everybody as if they have some kind of mental illness, when we attribute people's bad behavior to the sort of sufferings that they can't help, then we turn them into patients in a hospital. This is in direct contrast, of course, to the kind of classical idea of justice, which says, okay, you've done something wrong, now you must be punished, and after that punishment is over, you will go back into society, or you will have paid your debt, and you as a moral agent will be free to make better choices. It sounds much more compassionate to say, oh, you couldn't help it, you couldn't help yourself, you're just suffering from whatever social pathology, social ill, you named a bunch of them, systemic racism, climate change, what have you. And so what we need is to cure you. We don't need to punish you. We need to make you better. Here's the problem with this. There's no end to it. If you and everything that I perceive to be wrong about you are actually a pathology and something that I need to fix, then I, as the self-appointed doctor, can spend your entire life tweaking, nudging, repurposing, recreating you until you fit my perfect ideal of the state of nature. If this sounds familiar, it should, right? This is where you get stuff like the COVID lockdowns, like the World Economic Forum's theory of stakeholder capitalism, where an elect few who somehow know what the good is are constantly tweaking and nudging and reimagining human society until it looks the way they want it to look. Because as far as they're concerned, everything that's wrong with the world is a pathology that you should be grateful to be freed from. Your connection to your guns, right? Let's say your connection to your private property, your devotion to your nuclear family. All of this, you know, it might seem misguided, but really it's just a consequence of your upbringing, and you'll feel better once we fix it for you. That's the way that this thinking leads, even if it's not all the time what Rousseau is saying. His idea, of course, is that the general will, la volonté générale, is going to finally be perfected. There's always a degree of fuzziness about this, but somehow the people, our democracy, is going to end up with the outcome that heals us all from all our problems. If you want to see the wages of this, just look at the terrible consequences of the social policies of the 1960s. Read Myron Magnus' The Dream and the Nightmare. This stuff always goes wrong because it's based on a fundamental misapprehension about what human beings are.
Mm-hmm. Hence the quote, as you said earlier, men are born free, but everywhere in chains. The left today says, basically repeats this quote and says, we will unlock you from those chains. We, as you said, the elect few can figure out how to bring you back to this free, perfect state that we were all in before society corrupted us. Let's talk a little bit about Rousseau's account of this enslavement of man through civilization. This goes back to the first and second discourses that Rousseau writes. He has a lot of different writings and essays, but the main ones, and I think the ones that Spencer and I will be focusing on today, are the first and second discourses on arts and sciences and inequality, respectively. Those kind of diagnose or give the account in Rousseau's eyes of what the problem is. And then there is the social contract, in which Rousseau presents the prescription or the remedy. So we will obviously get to what that remedy or that prescription is. But first, let's talk about when and how it all went wrong in Rousseau's eyes. Forgive me for a moment, Spencer. I just want to read some quotes because I really like in these episodes reading directly from the authors, because some people listening may say, oh, well, these are two, conservative leaning individuals who are misrepresenting Rousseau's words and being excessively harsh on him. No, I want to read to people that this is really, really what he said, as ridiculous as it is. So in the first discourses, Rousseau gives this synopsis of early human history, how we went from being perfect to being corrupted. And here is kind of what he argues what went wrong. This is part of the story. He says, differences of soil, climate, and season forced humans to vary their ways of life. He talked about the height of trees, which prevented people from reaching fruits, the threat of animals in early civilization, which impelled people to work together to build fences. He talks about all of these external things, again, whether it's the climate, whether it's the height of trees, whether it's animals. And he says, this is what corrupted us. This is what made us divide our labor. And he views the division of labor as the early sin, because he says, as a result of this division of labor, equality disappeared, property was introduced, and naturally, division of labor engendered perceptions of certain relations in one's mind, who is large, small, strong, weak, fast, and slow. So this necessity to protect against nature led to this division of labor. This division of labor caused human beings to see each other as different in abilities as opposed to equal. And Rousseau says that created this inherent malignant trait of viewing man as better than others. Let's pause there before I go on, because that's already a lot to digest. What is your reaction to that? And also, it doesn't sound like there was ever an early period of bliss. I mean, my gosh, human beings from the time of Adam and Eve had to deal with differences of soil, climate, and seasons, heights of trees, and threats of animals. So when was this original alleged perfection?
Well, you'll be interested to know, and maybe you know already, that the problem for Rousseau is overpopulation, which is another kind of
I
buzzword
didn't know that.
now. But okay, so it's fascinating to me listening to you read that passage to reflect that the idea of natural selection is not one that originates with Charles Darwin. Darwin gives a kind of scientific stamp to this notion that had obtained for a long time. In fact, you can get it in some parts of Greek historiography as well. That it's our environment and our surroundings that makes us the kind of individuals that we are. And for Rousseau, in the early state of nature, it's our distance from one another. It's having enough space to be able to basically pursue our own ends and our own ways of life that makes it possible, at least for us, to coexist. And so the real problem is all these pesky people. There's so many of us. And what we really need is to get rid of, as Yuval Harari said, all these useless people. I mean, he didn't call for them to be gotten rid of, but this notion of the useless person, right, kind of comes into play as overpopulation becomes a problem. And it's in this contact of overpopulation that we end up creating private property. So there's another essay that I will just mention as well, which is the discourse on the origins of inequality, in which Rousseau talks about the first man who ever set stakes around a piece of land and said, "This is mine," and the first man who was naive enough to believe him. In other words, it's a facade, it's a fiction to say that anything belongs, any part of the earth belongs to anybody else. The earth is for everybody. And at that very moment, we should have pulled up the stakes and refused to allow civilization to start to take the direction that it took because, and this is key, right? In reality, mankind is foundationally equal at some profound level. And you think about this is a guy who dies a couple years after our revolution. And so the 18th century is the moment that gives birth to the American Revolution. And one of the big hot button issues at that time is what's the real right meaning of equality? What does it mean for men to be equal? And the American assessment is that man is equal in view of his creator, right? That we are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. And that is the way in which we are all the same. It doesn't therefore follow that we are all going to have the same abilities, that we're all going to deserve the same amounts of stuff, that we're all going to be as skillful as one another. And in Rousseau, what you get is this idea that because we are equal, the outward forms, the outward signs of equality should all be leveled out. So anybody who says that this plot of land is my plot of land and it's not yours is committing an act of dishonesty, is lying in order to get what's his. And if that's true, right, if private property is simply a facade, is simply a lie, then all of civilization as we know it is effectively a giant scheme played by the weak on the strong. And so, as you rightly say, this is how everything goes wrong for Rousseau. It goes wrong very early on. State of nature is imagined as a very brief, distant golden age. But the problem is we got too close together and we started claiming pieces of land as our own. And that's why, and that was fundamentally a lie because it was an attack on equality. All of this, of course, is baked in now to the assessment of equality, the assessment of private property that you get from the left. It was intensified by Marx, but it's present in Rousseau as well.
That word dishonesty that you said, that is a through line, I think, throughout Rousseau's writing. He thinks that civilization in its entirety is inherently dishonest because it creates these conventions that oppress people or subvert the authentic will of the human being. I'll read you another quote. Manners. Rousseau decries manners. He says that manners merely, quote, spread garlands of flowers over our vices. People, Rousseau says in the first discourse, can have, quote, all the appearance of virtues without having any of them. This produces a, quote, vile and deceitful uniformity where one no longer, dares to appear to be what one is. As a result, Rousseau says, quote, one will therefore never really be able to know those with whom one is dealing. So Rousseau's essentially arguing here, manners are dishonest. They are these nice, pretty things that we all engage in, but it's hiding how we really feel about one another. And it was better back in the Stone Age when you encountered a fellow Homo sapien on the path, and he didn't say hi, how are you? He just took his knife out and wanted to stab you. Rousseau thinks that that's better because that's more authentic. Even though manners kind of civilize us, they make us into these dishonest creatures, and it was better in a time where people were just out in the open about how they felt about you. It's an amazing thing because look, and we had this discussion, Spencer, with Marx. Some of what Marx diagnoses as far as problems with capitalism, they're not exactly wrong. Rousseau, similarly here too, he's not exactly wrong that, all of us in civilization have encountered people, you run into someone at the grocery store and you do that fake, hi, how are you? Good, how are you? Exchange. We've all done that. We all know what that's like. And Rousseau's highlighting it here. But what he doesn't seem to understand is that this is a buy-in of civilization. This is how you prevent murder and cannibalism and all of these things that existed in early primitive times. Yes, some of these things may be dishonest, but that's part of ensuring your prosperity and security.
It's really interesting to compare all of this in Rousseau to Freud, right? A much later thinker, but somebody that looms equally large, and who similarly creates this picture of the human life where what's inside of us at any given moment, our impulses, our raw experience, that's what's real. And then the stuff that we present to the world is a kind of artifice or a kind of lie. And that's basically what Rousseau is saying about manners here, right? He's saying when you say hi to somebody in the grocery store, instead of shoving them out of the way to get the box of Twinkies that you want or whatever, when you act nicely instead of doing that thing that everybody does on Black Friday and those online videos where they're climbing over each other to grab the TV that's on sale, right? That's when you're lying. That's when you're not really being your true authentic self. And for Rousseau, of course, your true authentic self is beautiful and virtuous rather than being the kind of beast that crawls, to grab whatever it can possibly get. It's something beautiful and pure. But the basic idea here is the same, is that whenever we put on a show, whenever we act a part for society, whenever we say something that we don't really feel at this given moment, we're being dishonest or insincere. And it's from this very idea that you get our modern notion of authenticity as the supreme virtue, right? Oh, she's really an authentic person. He was really authentic there. Which, if you think about it, you can be authentically evil. You can be an authentic jerk, as long as that part of you that's really true to yourself. And you hear people and see people doing appalling things now and defending themselves by saying, I had to follow my heart. If you saw the movie The Fabelmans, this was Spielberg's basically apologia for his mother's abandonment, is that she was following her heart, just like an artist has to follow his heart. And all of this, I think, misses something really key, which is right in Aristotle, which is in Aristotle's Politics. And it's a famous statement that mankind is by nature a political animal. And just as you said, there is nowhere that we observe this perfect state of nature. Similarly, there is nowhere that we observe human beings not doing this, not setting up rules of engagement, not developing modes of courtesy that they have to follow, not, always saying exactly what they think. And what that suggests is that it's not actually unnatural for us to be decorous, to have manners, to take care how we relate to one another. And so this idea that what's true about us is just whatever we happen to be feeling in any given moment and everything else is a lie, it's a very deep-rooted idea in our culture, but I don't actually think it makes any sense. It's part of us to aspire to more. It's part of us to understand that there are such things as, other people's feelings. It's part of us to aspire to virtue. And all of those things are natural, just the way our immediate impulses are. We're not just animals who feel things and then act on them immediately. We're human beings, and part of our nature is to form these kind of cultivated modes of interaction. And so if you're going to say, well, these manners are false or hypocritical, as you would say, that's a fair accusation in a lot of cases. Certainly in European high society in the 18th century, we can imagine that was a very big part of Rousseau's life. But at the same time, the notion that some manners are hypocritical raises the possibility that some manners might be true, might be genuine. And just because we don't feel like being civilized or nice in the moment, doesn't mean that we as a whole don't want ultimately to be civilized, to live in a genteel and kind way. And this stuff is actually baked into us too. It's a very low view of humanity, ultimately, to say that you are just whatever raw impulses or sexual desires or appetites you happen to be experiencing. It's a much higher, nobler view of humanity to say you are a political animal. That is to say, it is part of your nature to want to be better than just whatever you happen to think at this given moment. And it's weird, actually, in Rousseau that there doesn't seem to be a picture of sincere and honest morals, aspiration to a kind of civilized way of life, because that ought to be kind of the cure for all of this, rather than clearing everything away and just trying to get back to kind of what we are inside. Because as Jordan Peterson famously observes, tell somebody that they're just as good as they need to be the way they are is actually an insult. We all know that what's inside is kind of a mess, and we want to be invited to something higher and better and nobler, even if that means, we won't always get it right, and sometimes there'll be hypocrisy baked in. I think it's Bishop Robert Barron who calls this the hermeneutic of suspicion, that assumes the things we say to one another or the justifications we give for our higher actions and functions are all kind of lies, are all just a way of distracting from the reality of our guts and our desires. But I don't see any evidence for that to be the case. I don't see why our aspirations aren't part of us as well.
One of the reasons why I love you as a podcaster, author, is because you always have a way of ending on these triumphant notes. Yes, you're right. I mean, and it's something that our modern culture just does not focus on, and in fact ridicules this idea that our aspirational nature is as much a part of who we are as our impulses. And you look at people like, Marx just reduces us to this economic creature. Freud just reduces us to this sexual creature. Rousseau reduces us to a creature corrupted by civilization. It's a very sinister, dark, pessimistic understanding of a human being and what a human being can be. So anyway, I just wanted to comment. Thank you for renewing our faith and our understanding that we're better.
It's my pleasure. And it's also, by the way, an infinitely malleable person, if you think about it. The
Right.
idea that we've been shaped into something totally deformed by society suggests that society can shape us into anything it wants.
Yes,
And so
a good
really,
thing,
I think
too.
there is a kind of darkness there as well.
Right. So on this note, we've been talking about Rousseau's idea of original perfection. Men are born free, but elsewhere in chains. Men in state of nature were perfect. I'm a little confused because on the one hand, Rousseau's saying that we're perfect in the state of nature, but on the other hand, as he's describing manners here, he's saying it's spreading garlands of flowers over our vices. That seems to be an acknowledgement that we're not perfect, that we do have these malignant parts of our character. So I just wanted to clarify here, when Rousseau talks about original perfection, does he mean original goodness, like human beings are inherently good, or does he mean original perfection in the sense of we're not inherently good or we're not inherently perfect, but our relations with one another in those early stages were perfect?
It's an excellent question, and I have to suspect that Rousseau indulges in a little bit of fuzziness here, in just the same way that the general will is supposed to be the righteous and just way to organize a society, but no group of people ever really seems to embody the general will. Similarly, here, we have this idea that man is good, right? That mankind is a good thing would be one interpretation of that statement. But as you say, he has this very kind of naturalistic account of how we end up being terrible to one another. And of course, there are always circumstances that kind of prompt us to that. That's part of how we end up building these supposedly evil civilizational constructs like private property. But eventually you have to have the guy that makes the decision, right, to stake out his land and defend it against other people. And that for Rousseau is a a vicious decision, or at least a misguided decision. Um, One part of Rousseau's theory and philosophy that we haven't really talked about much at all is his idea of education, his philosophy of education, which is probably one of the most influential elements of his thought. This very, very famous and at the time quite celebrated text, Emile, which contains, among other things, the profession of faith of the Savoyard vicar, who kind of lays forth this very unorthodox but ultimately theist idea of the world where, men are kind of naturally innocent but get corrupted and all of this. It always comes back to this the malign or the positive influence of education. And I think that what Rousseau wants us to believe is that children, as they start to gain the use of logic, can hypothetically be guided into a perfectly enlightened state where what we would now call natural consequences education kind of leads them not to feel like they're going to get punished if they do something bad, but that the things that they do that are out of line with reason will bring misery naturally upon them. And it's the job of the enlightened educator to kind of steer them in that direction, set them these exercises that will reveal the kind of natural realities of the world and enable them to grow and mature rightly. And this is a theory of education that's profoundly influential in the 19th century and thereafter. I mean, John Dewey is a person that clearly draws on this a lot, and has a major influence on American education. This idea that we shouldn't punish our children just out of some sense of wrongdoing, but that all we're really trying to do is teach them to behave functionally in the world. I think that for Rousseau, the evil creeps into men's hearts when they don't have that kind of guidance, when they don't have somebody there to take care of them, as indeed they wouldn't have in the state of nature. And the problem, of course, is that then the question arises, well, for adult human beings, who is going to be that enlightened educator, right? Who is going to be that guide? And we need to mention, at least in this context, the fact that Rousseau and his lover, eventually his wife, Thérèse Levasseur, they had at least one, possibly 5 children out of wedlock that Rousseau effectively abandoned to public care. He tried to find them later on, but was unable to, and convinced Levasseur's family to kind of let go of these kids. And this was an accusation that was made at the time by people like Edmund Burke and some of his more critical contemporaries. And it does raise this issue, not to kind of be too ad hominem, but it raises this issue. If Rousseau himself isn't the perfect model of the caretaker,
Yes.
Then who really can be trusted to set himself up in this caretaker role over humanity? And it does seem to me as if anytime you have this idea that mankind needs shepherding to live out its full potential, you're ultimately going to end up putting yourself or your friends forward as the guys that are going to run everything. And the reason why that doesn't work is because, in fact, original sin is real and there is no one righteous. No, not one.
So interesting to know that Rousseau himself, is advocating for all of these things, but he himself wasn't embodying. I mean, did he ever think no one's going to trust me as an authority on these issues? Apparently not. Before we continue.
Yeah, I mean, that's just.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Please. Oh, I was just going to say, you see that a lot. I mean, you see people just kind of steamrolling through these major problems in their personal life and then declaring publicly, my perfect theory of the world. And it's not as if, we're all flawed, we're all broken, we all have some degree of hypocrisy, I think, in our lives. But we ought to, I think, be able to approach our ethics from a place of humility that acknowledges, I'm not perfect. Seneca, the great moral philosopher of the Roman Stoic tradition, says at one point in his letters, I'm like a fellow patient in a hospital writing to the next bed over. And I think that if you have that attitude, then you can speculate or discuss any kind of moral issue that you want. If you're completely oblivious to the inconsistencies between your personal life and your prescriptions, then I think there's some cause for suspicion there.
Boy, would it behoove people who are pro-defund the police and yet live behind gates and in Dorman buildings, wouldn't it behoove them to listen to what you just said? Before we continue with Spencer, I want to quickly tell you about MyPillow. Mike Lindell created MyPillow to help all of us get the best sleep of our lives that we all need and deserve. That's why he created the Giza Dream bed sheets, which I own, I sleep on. They are great. I would not advertise something that I did not use and enjoy. And you can use them and enjoy them yourself at a discount if you use the promo code Hartman, which is my last name, spelled Hartman. For a limited time, you will get 60% off of these Giza Dream sheets that comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You will also receive a Mike softcover book free when you use the promo code Hartman, and you'll get this set for as low as $39.99. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listener square and use the promo code Hartman, or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. In our limited time, Spencer, would you please provide us, and there's no one better to do it in limited time than you, with an analysis or a synopsis of this very difficult this very difficult solution that Rousseau puts forth, which is the social contract. So he says we're born perfect. Everything was perfect at one point. Society, animals, trees, climate, soil, manners, all of it corrupted us. What is the proposal for the path forward, according to Rousseau?
Right. Well, we've touched on it a couple times. You mentioned le contrat social, the social contract. And this is not an idea that originates with Rousseau, but he has a very specific description or idea about how it ought to work. And it has to do with this crucial notion of the general will. Now, I mentioned that Rousseau's thinking was quite influenced by his experience growing up in Geneva. At the time that he was a young man, Geneva was ostensibly a democratic state, but was actually, in many ways, kind of captured by a few oligarchic interests. So a little bit like Florence in the time of Machiavelli, a kind of similar situation. And Rousseau, observing as he often did the hypocrisy inherent in this situation, thought that the ideal was direct democracy, essentially. Not representative democracy of the kind that we have, not some sort of republic, but this democracy where everybody gets to vote. All these citizens get to make decisions on each thing. And out of this, there emerges something called the general will, which is the only legitimate form of government, the only thing that we can really righteously obey, and that writes the laws for us. And so the question then becomes, well, is the general will just whatever anybody decides, or is it a kind of transcendent embodiment of the best in each of us? And in order for us to imagine that the general will is anything other than just mob rule, we have to kind of hazily picture it as this perfect, enlightened set of ideas and laws, guided by the lawgiver, guided by a virtuous statesman, into a perfect state. The problem, besides the fact that nobody's ever seen this happen before, is that ultimately it really ends up being the lawgiver who makes these decisions. And it's not hard to see in this the kind of precursor of the Soviet state, where, for instance, ostensibly you have a vote, but really you're just there to kind of mouth your assent to the totalizing control of the state. And your mileage may vary. You pay your money and you take your choice on this. Some people think Rousseau just wants us all to live happily in harmony. Some people think he wants us all to obey and find our peace and our freedom in submitting to a totalitarian state. But either way, you have to answer this question: how are the people going to come up with this enlightened, perfected will? And the answer in practice is always going to turn out to be, oh, it's me and my friends. We're going to interpret the general will, and then you're going to shut up and follow it. Ideally, what we are in is utopia. It always ends up being totalitarianism. Exactly.
Gratuitous assertions about the past and gratuitous assertions about the future. That certainly characterizes Rousseau. You know, it's funny because his entire work is an indictment of civilization. All the bad things that civilization has done to us. The irony is that he is kind of the indictment of civilization. He shows actually some defects that civilization produces, namely that when you get to a affluent, enlightened, civilized society, such as the one that he grew up in the 18th century, it allows for the population to have leisure time and come up with crazy ideas like the one that Rousseau came up with. That's to me what's the ultimate ha-ha about all of this.
And you think that it can come out of nowhere, which I think is another problem of civilization, right? You imagine that social order is natural when actually it's been hammered out for generations before you.
Yes, I say that, we tend to think of luxuries as items, fine jewelry, private planes, nice cars, beautiful homes, but ideologies are luxuries too. Ideologies are just, some ideologies are just as luxurious as any fine item. And again, it does say something about civilization that it would produce someone like Rousseau. That doesn't mean, I'm not going along with the Rousseau idea that civilization is all wrong and that it's all civilization's fault for everything. But yes, he is proof that too much affluence, too much leisure can lead to craziness. And that's the moment in the United States now.
George Orwell is famously quoted as saying that there are some ideas so foolish that only an intellectual could believe them. And I think we're probably dealing with a case of that when we get to the notion that everything can be cured out of humanity and a perfect state can come down to save us all.
Yes, absolutely. Spencer, as always, it is great to be with you. I've learned so much, and I'm sure the viewers have too. I appreciate your time.
Oh, it's been a delight. Thanks for having me on. We'll do it again soon.
Yes, it goes by really fast. I got to tell you. I remember the first time we were doing this 3 months ago. We've done Nietzsche, Marx, Rousseau, and I would say...
Stay tuned for more.
Stay tuned, because we definitely know who we're doing next. And we're deciding it from you. I look forward to seeing you soon, Spencer, and I look forward to seeing all of you soon as well. Take care.